Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray, your weekly fix of ancient warfare-related ranting and musing. I try and stay in 10 minutes. Sometimes I fail, sometimes I succeed. Sometimes I even say what I have to in less than 10 minutes, but I don't like to do that. I do like to give you at least 10-minute break from your normal life to think about ancient warfare. Of course, you can ask a question here. That's what I do. I answer questions from readers, viewers, and listeners. You can send us an email, a postcard. You can comment on a previous podcast or video. You can back us on Patreon, one of 3 different levels: Legionary, Optio, and Centurion. This question is from Peter. Peter Carr has said, "You had an interesting idea I hadn't heard before, that outflanking your opponent was considered poor form, cowardly, ungentlemanly, and lacking heroic virtue. So, when did outflanking become a tactical innovation employed with intent?" Okay, gosh. So indeed, when we look at warfare and the idea, now it's again, I've said this before, and it's another joke, I'm going to make it again. It is a Meryl Streep, Alec Baldwin, Steve Martin comedy. It's complicated. And that is that in Homer, much of the battling and the warfare is fair, and it comes down to the prowess of the individual as to whether they win or not. Having said that, of course, you have stratagems and trickery by Odysseus most famously, but others as well. And the idea of trickery is a really interesting one. Recently, I was reading up about the Battle of Sipaya in 494 BC between Cleomenes and the Argives, and he involves a trick which is sort of condemned by Herodotus and Pausanias and Plutarch, that it's like, yeah, you're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to pretend to go to breakfast and then attack us. The Argives are mirroring what the Spartans do in that battle. So when the Spartans announce by their herald that they're going to have breakfast, the Argives have breakfast too. Cleomenes observes this and says, right, next time I say we're going to have breakfast, we attack. So, of course, they announce breakfast. The Argives go and have their own breakfast. The Spartans attack. Now, that's a brilliant stratagem, but it's painted in the sources as a negative. You were unfair. You did that poorly. And so many of the other battles that we look at in the Persian Wars and thereafter, even though we lack sources, are quite frontal, and that they are all about the prowess and the we will fight where, is honourable arguments at the Battle of Plataea as to who deserves to fight on the right flank, the left flank, who should stand next to who, and all of that sort of thing. Similarly at the Battle of Marathon. And so this idea of outflanking as deliberate and more than deliberate good generalship, rather than being accused of trickery as a negative, rather than as very good strategizing, is an interesting one. And as like most things in the ancient world and beyond, we can look at our own world right this moment. Innovations in warfare occur on the battlefield. They don't occur theoretically not on battlefields. You have to test them. And what happens, of course, is in the Peloponnesian War, you start to get a lot of interesting developments in that sense. And I'm going to say, and again, I'm not going to sit on the fence, I'm going to put a date out there and give an individual who I think is responsible for all this sort of thing. And I think it's Demosthenes, not the orator, the general in the Peloponnesian War. And I think it's the Battle of Olpae in 426 BC. I said in an earlier podcast that there's a sort of outflanking happening at the Battle of Delium in 424, but it's almost accidental, and it's a misinterpretation of the Theban cavalry arriving, and the Athenians think they're being outflanked. Now, interestingly, them thinking they're being outflanked implies that outflanking may have occurred by this point in time, rather than it being a shock. Oh my gosh, they're cheating, which is certainly sort of the idea, especially by the Argives at the Battle of Sipaya. Now, at the Battle of Olpae, what you get is Demosthenes has basically he's gone to Arcania and been defeated and lost his men, lost 120 hoplites, I think it is, and he's afraid to return home to Athens because he knows he's going to be prosecuted because he's lost all these men. So he stays in Arcania, and he's then asked if he can help the Arcanians defeat a force that comes against them. So what you find is that there's Peloponnesians in the we're told Peloponnesians, but only 2 Spartans, but they're of course given the command. And Demosthenes places an ambush of 400 Arcanian hoplites and light troops in a sunken road overgrown with bushes. This is in Book 3 of Thucydides. And the reason for this is that the 2 armies, as so often, camp opposite one each other for 5 days in Thucydides, and they don't do anything. And we think that, when that happens, what are they doing? And they're probably scouting out territory and where is the good terrain, where's the best place to fight, that sort of thing. But it certainly seems as if in this case, Demosthenes sees this sunken road and sees that it's hidden and obscured from view from the battlefield. And so he intends that these 400 men will stay hidden out of sight of the 2 armies until the moment of collision of the hoplite phalanxes, and then attack the enemy in rear at that point where the lines overlap. So this is a deliberate ambush attack on the flank. It's not a battle of Cannae envelopment that we see later. It's definitely a specific force detached to attack the flank when the 2 armies are engaged frontally. Obviously, those sorts of developments to envelopment and double envelopment that we find in later warfare, they're a later development. But I think this is the first time that you actually get a deliberate choice to detach a force to attack in the flank when the armies are engaged. So for those of you who want to read up, it's Thucydides 3, chapter 107. More than that, of course, this absolutely has the desired effect. And, now I'm thinking on the spot, what about the Messenians that go and get behind the last Spartans at the Battle of Sphacteria that climb the cliff? I don't think that's quite the same. And certainly in the frontal battle at Sphacteria, even though there's many more Athenians than there are Spartans defending, it's a frontal battle, and it's a throwing of missiles. There's no attempt to encircle or outflank there. Only later, when they withdraw to the top of the island, does this force of Messenians basically say, right, we'll climb the cliffs and get behind them. And that leads to the unthinkable surrender of the Spartans. So I think I'm going to stick with my battle. Although, of course, that's a year later. Well, what am I saying? It is the Battle of Olpae, 426 BC. There you go. I'm going to stick to my guns. And so I think in this case, you've got a successful attack on the flank. More than that, of course, the Peloponnesians are so shocked that the rout occurs, that the attack occurs in the way it does on their flank, they rout immediately. According to Thucydides, it's all, the Peloponnesians, because the Allies have detached a force of 400, the Peloponnesians outflank them, and they are about to encircle them because they've depleted their line. So that, even in Thucydides' way of talking about the battle, he's talking about overlapping and enveloping. And I think that when you look at earlier battles, there isn't that talk. So anyway, I think that by the time Thucydides is writing this up, that idea and that it's valid and not sneaky and somehow perfidous has sunk in, that in warfare things are expedient, you do what's required. And it's really interesting against, for instance, that battle of Sepia that I was talking about before. When Polyaenus comes to write that up, it's a brilliant trick that Cleomenes has. Whereas when Herodotus and Plutarch and Pausanias are writing it up, it's trickier. There's a different trick going on in Pausanias. It's an oath of truce that he breaks, so it's even worse. It's impiety. Whereas in Herodotus, it's tricky, but it isn't impious, but it's still negative. Whereas by the time of Polyaenus in the 2nd century AD, he recognizes it as a brilliant strategy to win a battle. Anyway, I hope that answers your question, Peter, and you can join me again for another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers. Thanks. Bye.